What if a woman wrote a James Bond story? Hi guys, it is me. I've been trying to make this video for ages and I keep procrastinating about it, so I'm going to sit down and do it. The other day I made a video about Kim Sherwood, who's the young and talented author who's been selected by the Ian Fleming Foundation to write a trilogy of books called the Double O Trilogy. And as he always does, the awesome Alex Lamas popped in and left a very smart comment and asked this question. What if a woman wrote a Bond story? What would a female perspective bring to Bond? Could she write him without fundamentally changing him? Could we have essentially Fleming's Bond with all his faults and foibles, but remaining the quintessential hero of the novel and all his strength as well? Really interesting question. Because, you know, James Bond is seen as like such a masculine character, and his books are very much, you know, used as the epitome of the male voice. So the question is, what would happen if a woman was to write that? But the thing is, it's a question I think it's almost answered itself. Most Bond fans that you speak to will say that James Bond isn't actually the hyper-masculine character that casuals might think he is. And in fact, if you read the books especially, they are very nuanced and emotional. Joe Darlington said like Casino Royale is almost like a romance book, and No Time to Die, the recent film, that's like a romance story with an unhappy ending. So I think there's a lot of balanced feminine energy in Bond already, and there's a lot of female influence to it that I think we ought to discuss. Because, well, first of all, the question, what if a woman wrote a Bond story? I write romance novels, so I'm not in any position to be like, no, you shouldn't write that because that's masculine writing, you shouldn't write that because that's feminine writing. I don't really think that there is men's writing or women's writing. I think there are styles of books that are targeted towards women, there are styles of books that are targeted towards men. I think there are types of books that resonate with a majority female audience and books that resonate with a majority male audience. But it is very far from cut and dried. And being in the field of writing that I'm in, I'm always astonished at how I see male writers write with a lot of feminine energy and female writers write with a lot of male energy. You can say that there are certain trends in writing that might trend towards male or female authors, but on the whole it's like such a spectrum. I mean, my shtick, I think the reason I've been successful is because I write the big explosive action thrillers that I want to, except I write them as romance novels. But I am really disciplined about writing them to the beats and formula of a romance novel. And a romance novel is all about emotion, the relationship between the hero and the heroine, which casts a completely different perspective on the thriller aspect, because a male writer might be tempted to write the thriller aspect as the thriller aspect and have the romance on the side, whereas a romance author has the romance as the meat of the meal, and the side dishes are the thriller thing. So I enjoy doing that, and I think I bring a lot of the masculine energy that about the books that I grew up really loving, and put it together with the romance books and the women's books that I grew up reading and really had such a huge influence on me and created something new. And I think that's what authors do. They always create something new. And this is why having Kim Sherwood come in and write the Double O Trilogy, I mean, I can be as skeptical as I want because she's only had one book published before, but the fact that she's a woman, I don't think that makes any difference at all. In fact, if she's going to be writing about other 00 agents, those 00 agents might be women, so therefore you are seeing things through the perspective of a woman anyway. And that's a perspective that Ian Fleming definitely 100% canonically wanted people to see, because he wrote an entire book from a woman's perspective. He wrote The Spy Who Loved Me, which was first-person perspective from the perspective of Vivian Michelle, the female main character. So, you know, if you're going to say what would happen if a woman wrote a Bond story, we've kind of got some of the elements there. I mean, Ian Fleming wrote a book that the Bond book club that they had about The Spy Who Loved Me was fascinating, really fascinating. But he wrote a book from a perspective of a woman, and for all of the things I think you can say he got wrong about that, and I'm aware I write chapters from female points of view, so I am aware that it is very, very difficult to make them sound authentic and be authentic and do the female characters justice as a writer who might not be of that same gender. I think Ian Fleming did as good a job as he could, and I think he did a very real job, and he did a very raw and authentic job with the history of Vivian Michelle and things like that. So he clearly saw value in telling the story of James Bond from a woman's perspective, and it might have been an experiment. It might have been an experiment that most critics say failed, but at the end of the day, it was an experiment that he thought was important enough to write an entire book about. So yeah, female perspective is already like a big part of Bond. And I think also when you're talking about the character of James Bond is there, and he's not a masculine, well, he's a masculine character, but it's like Ian Fleming saw that the feminine perspective of James Bond was as equally valid as the male perspective. And I think that's why James Bond as a fandom is very equal opportunity. Even though James Bond is seen as like this hyper-masculine character in the Bond community, there are some shining stars of women who love and appreciate James Bond and bring really valuable perspectives to what the James Bond fandom is. I mean, I don't want to miss anyone out, so I'm going to mention like my quick top 3. There's Jocelyn from Ladies Who Bond, who, what I love about what she brings to the Bond community is she's a Bond fan like me. She's a Bond fan like you. She's a Bond fan who really loves it and gets it. There are people like James Burb on Instagram, Melanie. Like, the perspective and viewpoint that she brings to discussions is electric. Like, I was on a podcast with her and the crew from the James Bond complex recently, and there was that one line from No Time to Die where Madeleine says, "She's not yours," about this 5-year-old child that Bond has just discovered. And Melanie had a little, and I had a little back and forth, because yeah, from a man's perspective that line means something, from a woman's perspective that line means so much more, because to be honest, women are so much more sophisticated in communication. This is why they tend to be more successful in writing. But there is just the fact that the same line of dialogue can have 2 interpretations from a man and a woman, is why it's so exciting to bring female perspectives and female voices into the world of James Bond. And then finally, the last of many brilliant women in the Bond community that I want to talk about is Dr. Lisa Funnell, who I'm a huge fan. I've been reading all of the forwards and the books she's edited and stuff like that about looking at action movies and the James Bond franchise in particular through the perspective of feminism. And I think that's really interesting and important and valuable work. And it's funny, I know Dr. Funnell gets a lot of flack from fans because she will sometimes make statements that they get butthurt about. But for me, what I think is really interesting is these perspectives and seeing things through the viewpoint of feminism. There are things you can take away from that you agree with. There's some things you might not necessarily agree with, but it's all interesting. And if you have any soul at all, you shouldn't feel threatened by other people looking into your fandom. But what I love is the fact that Dr. Funnell's appreciation and dissection of things like James Bond comes from a place of appreciation and love of the fandom. So James Bond as a whole, hopefully everybody thinks is an equal opportunities fandom. And I mean, the wonderful thing about it is you've got, trans fans of James Bond, you've got queer fans of James Bond, you've got people from every single colour palette in the world who are fans of James Bond. It is not just like a white man's club, and I love that about the fandom. But that also means that this fandom, because something in it resonates with so many diverse people, those diverse people, it would be a crime not to hear their perspective and what resonated. And so yeah, diversity in talking and writing and dissecting and enjoying James Bond, I think is really, really, really the core of what makes it special. So what if a woman wrote a James Bond story? Bring it on, I would love to read it. But you could also say that James Bond has already been written by a woman. I mean, we've already got the example of Ian Fleming writing The Spy Who Loved Me, which is from the perspective of a woman. So you could say, James Bond was written by a woman, written by a man. But what about No Time to Die, the movie that just blew me away when I saw it in the cinemas? Daniel Craig specifically brought on board Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who wrote Fleabag, to help with the script and things. And I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty certain that some of the more nuanced and the more sophisticated things in the script, the stuff that really stood out to me from every single other James Bond film that had ever gone before it, I think probably came from her contributions to it. There's a lot of wit and smartness that was not typical of a James Bond film. And so, yeah, that shows that the female perspective on James Bond, as I said before, just enriches it. It doesn't take anything away, it just enriches it. It's also worth pointing out that Phoebe Waller-Bridge is not the first woman to write a James Bond movie. In fact, the first two movies, Dr. No and From Russia with Love, had a script editor or script contributor called Joanna Harwood, who had co-screenwriting credits for both Dr. No and From Russia with Love. She was brought on board as Terence Young called her a script doctor to sort of doctor the script. And Richard Maybaum, who was one of the writers, he was put out that she was brought on board, and he was upset that she was given co-writing credits even though she was like a script doctor. But even he conceded that she'd made some good suggestions about the script. So the fact that Dr. No and then From Russia with Love then gave birth to this iconic franchise that is now 25 movies deep. Would that have happened if a woman wasn't one of the co-writers of those first two scripts? Who knows? Who knows? So anyway, I've spoken about how James Bond has already been written by a woman. But it's worth pointing out that James Bond has already been written by a woman. In fact, two women we can think of right now. There's Kim Sherwood, who's about to write the 00 trilogy, which, even though James Bond is going to be missing in those trilogy of books, it's going to be the same world and the same thing, and James Bond is going to be mentioned by name, so she's writing a James Bond book. But there's also this wonderful writer called Kate Westbrook, who's actually, in real life, she's called Samantha Weinberg, but she wrote a series of books called the Moneypenny Diaries, which were basically stories from Miss Moneypenny's perspective, and again, Bond was a character in those stories. So you can say James Bond has already been written by a woman. And those books were really fun. And if you go, I'll stick a link down below, because if you go onto Amazon right now, I think you can get one of her Moneypenny short stories for free. You can download it straight to your Kindle, so go and check it out. It's definitely worth checking out. And those were very, very successful as well, and very well respected. I don't think anyone criticised them. It's really interesting that so many women have contributed to James Bond before we had such a hyper awareness of gender in these things, and nobody complained about it before. So it's kind of an interesting thing to have secretly behind closed doors in the closet, like this big feminine energy that's kind of intrinsic to what James Bond is, and nobody's really given the James Bond franchise credit for actually having that right from its inception in some ways. And while we're on the subject of that, I mean, let's just say in 1995, Albert Broccoli passed on the James Bond brand from the movies, which I know is separate from the books, but come on, it's all kind of the same wheelhouse. He passed that on to his daughter, Barbara Broccoli, and Michael G. Wilson. And Barbara Broccoli, since then, has had huge influence on what James Bond is in popular culture. Again, I know it's separate from the books, but like, James Bond is an icon right from the 90s, right from when Pierce Brosnan came in, and you had that M brought in as a woman, and you had some of those wonderful Miss Moneypenny. Oh, Samantha Bond was just brilliant as Miss Moneypenny. Barbara Broccoli has helped guide the James Bond franchise through some very murky waters, and I think she is M, really. She brings so much wisdom and nuance to what James Bond is. And she has an understanding, I think, of where James Bond fits into culture that perhaps a man might not have. So, yeah, if we all were talking here, what if a woman wrote a James Bond story? I think the entire Bond story, since 1995 at least, has kind of been written by a woman. I think it's wonderful. I think this is what has always appealed to me about James Bond as opposed to other franchises. Because, again, I grew up liking men's books, but also liking women's literature and women's sagas and romance books. And I think maybe that's why I always liked James Bond, because even though the newspaper headlines might call it hypermasculine, there is a lot of feminine energy that gets brought in there and mixes it, and that's why there's something special about it. In terms, though, practical terms, let's go into practical terms. What if a woman wrote a James Bond story? Well, with the exception of The Spy Who Loved Me, which was written from a woman's perspective, all of the James Bond stories tend to be written from third-person perspective, which I think lends itself to having an author from any background come in. The wonderful thing about writing in third person especially, is you have a character, and the character exists in your head, so you know how a character would react in certain circumstances. And then you show that to the reader by describing what it is they do. You don't tell them. You don't say, like, Bond was angry. Well, Bond never gets angry. I'm even going to make a video about that. Okay, let's say, you wouldn't say Bond was inquisitive, or Bond wondered what was going on. You'd say Bond raised an eyebrow. It's all show, not tell. And in third-person perspective, that's what you have to do. Even though there's a lot of introspection in the early James Bond books by Ian Fleming, but for the most part, books especially like Thunderball are very much show, not tell, when it comes to storytelling. And yeah, absolutely, a woman can come in and do that. I mean, as long as you have some intrinsic understanding of James Bond, his motivations, and how he would act under certain circumstances, anybody who understands that, male or female, can write it. You just have to have a really good understanding of what the James Bond character is. And when it comes to even the impossibility of writing a first-person perspective, I mean, I don't think we'll ever see a James Bond story written from the first-person perspective of James Bond. But let's say that did happen. I think there's a lot of value to that being written by a man, because, you know, it's easier perhaps for a man to have a masculine voice, to find certain elements that resonate with male readers. But it is absolutely by no means like a hard and fast rule. And I say that very, very hyper aware of the fact that I write romance, which is a women's genre in books traditionally, and my books are written in the contemporary romance style of a chapter from the man's point of view and a chapter from the woman's point of view. So I write first-person perspective from the viewpoint of a woman, and I am hyper aware of the fact that that is a very, very treacherous tightrope to walk. And so my philosophy in it is, I don't invent anything. When I write from from the perspective of a female character, the character should be solid enough in my head and my understanding to know how they would react to certain circumstances, how they behave when certain things occur to them. But in terms of what they think, their inner monologues, their motivations and stuff, I don't invent anything. I am approaching my mid-40s. I have many female friends, many female relationships. I listen constantly to people. And so when I write female characters, what I try and do is look back in my past and think of real things women I've known have said or told me or done or written to me, and take those and sort of piece the narrative together like a jigsaw puzzle. And that way I try, and I'm sure I fail, but I try to use things that come from women and that are authentic from women to piece together this character, to try and give it some authenticity. And if a woman reads it, and the majority of my readers are women, they read it and it doesn't come across as like obviously written by a man who doesn't get it. I try and have reverence for everything that I have heard from women that I am able to use to help guide my writing. And as I said, I'm probably fail. And there have definitely been some elements in my books that it's like, oh, that's clearly written by a guy. But for the most part, the majority of my readers are women, and I have received a lot of praise from women for hopefully, not praise, nobody's ever brought it up as a problem. Nobody's been like, oh my god, that's complete garbage. So if I can do that and convince myself that I can get away with it, I'm sure a female author of more talent than me would be able to do an absolutely fine, brilliant job, kind of working to the same thing, writing James Bond story from first person perspective. At the end of the day, it does come down to your craftsmanship as an author and your ability to channel your life experiences. So yeah, I don't think that you should by any means say that a woman couldn't even do that. It's like, Yeah, that as far as it goes, equal opportunity everywhere. That being said, though, let me get on to the controversial stuff. So, for me and a lot of other guys, I think one of the reasons why we get concerned when there's this talk of like, oh, this woman's being brought in, we need more female representation, stuff like that, is because, well, firstly, if you're a real fan of James Bond, hopefully you know that there is a lot of female representation in there. But secondly, it's not that we are trying to keep women out of the James Bond franchise. Far from it. It's just the James Bond franchise, to a lot of us, is kind of like a safe place. I mean, me as a man, when I've faced problems in the past and things like that, I've found a lot of solace in reading the James Bond books, watching the James Bond movies. When you look at James Bond as he's depicted on screen, especially in Daniel Craig's day, there's a lot you look there and say like, okay, if I'm in a shitty situation, what would James Bond do? And you try and cling to that. So James Bond is something that is very precious to a lot of men, to an extent that I think people don't fully appreciate. And the really interesting thing, when I talked to License to Queer, it was really interesting that he and I, even though he's gay and I'm straight, we both found so much about James Bond through the same experience, of the same masculine experience to cling to, like the feelings of loneliness, isolation, standing out, not being part of the pack. There are things in there that Ian Fleming, and through Ian Fleming, Eon and Barbara Broccoli and all the writers who contributed to the James Bond movies, managed to write, that resonates and speaks really deeply with a lot of men. And so I think, as much as I absolutely support all diversity in storytelling, I don't want it to come at, I think we as male fans sometimes get worried that it will come at the risk of taking away something that is precious to us. I don't believe that's the case. I really don't. I think the people who are brought in from every single perspective to write about James Bond have a reverence for what James Bond is, and they have an understanding of what it means, and they can bring their new perspectives to it. They can add more to what James Bond is without taking anything away. But there is that core possessiveness that I think a lot of men have towards James Bond as a character and as a franchise, and I think I feel that as well. And people make, I mean, what's one of the reasons why I get upset when people make fun of James Bond? I mean, people always, there was actually, if Jeremy Duns wrote this wonderful book called Enemy Action, about all of the people and critics who kind of like lambasted Ian Fleming. And there was examples of people like spoofing the writing of Ian Fleming, and it's very, very popular to do that these days. You know, the male voice, and isn't it stupid? And it's like, oh, James Bond woke in the morning, smoked 70 cigarettes, guzzled a gallon of whiskey, and went off and had sex with 14 women because I'm a man. They're always making fun of it, and to a certain extent, one of the reasons I get offended by that is because there's a certain element of truth to it. But the thing is, yes, maybe there is something kind of like hokey and formulaic about the male voice in literature, but at the same time, the male voice in literature resonates with male readers really, really deeply and strongly, and that's why it exists, and that is why it has remained popular. And I think it is a really bad and ignorant position to make fun of the male voice in writing. It's all very well to make fun of male authors, but it's like, if you want examples of bad writing in romance, that's all written by female authors. I don't think men are worse authors than women. I don't think women are worse authors than men. I think they're just bad authors. And I think there's a really troubling and distasteful sexism in criticizing the male voice and male writing. It's like, you know what? Publishing and writing is a female-dominated industry, and it deserves to be. Women have always been the ones who are more successful as writers. Women are the ones who tend to read more. I think it's 84% of people who work in publishing are women. If you look at the top 10 best-selling authors of the last 200 years, 6 of them are women, which doesn't sound like a huge gap. But when you think Agatha Christie, who I think is number 1 on that list, sold a billion with a B, more books than any male author. So I think it's fair to say that, listen, writing is a place where women have, it's one of the few areas where women have like a space. So please don't take away our space as men. We enjoy reading books. We enjoy the male voice. These are the things that are precious to us. And if you appreciate the things that are precious to you, please try not to mock and take away from what is precious to us. And I think it's very important when we talk about space. And the wonderful thing about authors like Kim Sherwood coming up to write the 00 trilogy is she is doing what I said earlier, adding stuff to what James Bond is without taking anything away. I have no idea if this is true or not, but I imagine Kim Sherwood got the position of writing the 00 trilogy because she went to the Ian Fleming Foundation and pitched them an idea and did it so convincingly in a place of such authenticity as a fan of James Bond that they were like, yeah, she gets it, we're going to run this. She created space. So as a female author, she is absolutely entitled to occupy the space that she created. We as James Bond fans would not have the 00 trilogy if it wasn't for her coming in with these ideas. That's great. But then there are spaces that are already occupied. Like every year or so, Anthony Horowitz writes a new James Bond book, and Anthony Horowitz is a master at his craft. I did a review of Forever and a Day, and I said it was almost disquieting how brilliant he was at, I wouldn't even call it mimicking, I was like an echoing the voice and tone of Ian Fleming. I think in some ways the only thing wrong with it was that he's a stronger writer than Ian Fleming. He's just got so much more structure to what he writes. So yeah, there is a James Bond book every year written by an author chosen by the Ian Fleming Foundation. Currently it is Anthony Horowitz. He does a fantastic job. So when you say, what if a woman wrote a Bond story, I'm all for that, but not if it was like, Anthony Horowitz is not going to be writing the next James Bond book, it's going to be a female author. It's like, if you want to bring in a female author and boot Anthony Horowitz out, I mean, if this book that is going to be written by a female author comes at the cost of a book that was written by Anthony Horowitz, we need to have a different conversation about that, because then that is a situation that I don't approve of. And it's not necessarily that Anthony Horowitz is a man and they'd be bringing in a female author. It's just Anthony Horowitz does a fantastic job as a writer. So any writer you bring in to replace him would have to do as good or better a job. And I mean, it's Anthony Horowitz we're talking about here. That's not... He leaves some pretty big shoes to fill, although I'm sure there are many, many brilliant female writers who could probably come in and do a wonderful job. I mean, if they had Anthony Horowitz writing a book every year and they brought in a female author to write another book every year, that would be great. But then you've got all of the complications of like, do they exist in the same world together? Are they canon? And I mean, that's already a big mess anyway. Forever and a Day was a prequel to Casino Royale, whereas you have a bunch of other James Bond continuation books that are kind of like canon to the later things, and then they bring them in when he's young. It's a big mess. It's like the movies. Like, to try and make sense of the multiverse of James Bond is absolutely impossible when you get Doctor Strange in here. But my basic point is like, I am all for a woman writing a James Bond story as long as it does not come at the cost of somebody who is already doing a good job not being able to write a James Bond story. And you'd also have to wonder about the motivation for why somebody would want to do that. It's like, it is very, very cool and hip now to say like, oh, we're trying to have more diverse input from different writers, and that's brilliant. And as I said, there are so many different perspectives that diversity could bring to what James Bond is. At the same time, though, you'll find a lot of James Bond fans are very, very against this whole idea of being woke. I'm not even... Woke is such it's such an unsettling term. It makes me very uncomfortable. Woke is like bringing certain perspectives and certain social issues to light. And to a certain extent, James Bond has always been on the cutting edge of this. I mean, right from when Barbara Broccoli took over with GoldenEye in the movies, you know, they had Bond with a female boss, and they had Miss Moneypenny having some pretty sharp barbs with Pierce Brosnan. I do love their relationship. Samantha Bond is right up there in terms of my favourite Moneypennies. So it's always been on the cutting edge of like gender politics, but at the same time, it's always stood the line, which is really interesting. And the idea of bringing in elements or writers or people for the sake of trying to bring in a certain agenda is repellent to most James Bond fans. And it's not that the agenda is necessarily wrong, it's just anything that is woke, so to speak, tends to come across as incredibly inauthentic. Like if you look at the Ghostbusters movie, you had the 2016 Ghostbusters and you had the 2021 Ghostbusters. The 2016 Ghostbusters, they were like, we're going to replace, Ghostbusters was such a boys' film, so we're going to replace all the men with women. And we're going to pretend all the stuff that the male characters did never even existed. And it's like, yeah, that's why you lose people. People are like, what are you doing? And then you watch the movie, and the movie is, the 2016 Ghostbusters is an entertaining movie. It's like right up there with like Undercover Brother is like Saturday Night Live entertainment. However, it lacks the authenticity that the original Ghostbusters had. When you watch the 2021 Ghostbusters, which has a female protagonist, it has a diversity in the Ghostbusters that are there. It has all of the elements that you need in your check sheet, your woke check sheet, baked right into it. But it comes from a place of reverence and authenticity, which is why it works so powerfully. And the 2016 one was garbage. So you've got to think, if you're going to bring in like quote unquote woke elements, they have to be authentic. And I would say this is where No Time to Die did a really, really fantastic job. And I know there are some James Bond fans who don't like it, but for me, as a dad, as a guy in his 40s, certain things that occurred in it, like when James Bond finds out he has a daughter, when James Bond suspects that Madeline betrays him, there are certain things in it that hit me super, super hard and worked really, really authentically. And they brought in all of those elements that people who are like quote-unquote woke want to see, but at the same time it did it in a way that was nuanced and balanced and resonated equally with James Bond fans and new audiences. So that's how you do it. That's why you have someone like Phoebe Waller-Bridge coming in and doing it instead of somebody like Paul Feige who made that 2016 Ghostbusters movie. You need that authenticity. So yeah, what would happen if a woman wrote a Bond story? I think it's going to be great, as long as it is a woman like Kim Sherwood who comes into it being a super fan already. Because whatever she's going to give us super fans are just going to eat up, because we speak the same language. But if you bring in outsiders with an agenda they want to push in a book, then Bond fans are going to reject that. And I think it's entirely fair for them to reject that. Because as I said, this is something that is precious to us. And the wonderful thing about James Bond is the fact that the people who own it understand how precious it is to us. I mean, Barbara Broccoli, I think, has done a wonderful job with the movies, towing the line of being relevant to contemporary society, but at the same time being loyal to the fans and the community that just adore James Bond. The Ian Fleming Foundation has done a really, really wonderful job bringing in writers like Anthony Horowitz to give us the stuff that we really want, and then bringing in new writers like Kate Westbrook and Kim Sherwood to give us what we didn't know we wanted, but we want it just the same. So there is this core ideal of authenticity that I think is so vital to why James Bond works, whether it's in book or in the movies. And so I would say anybody from any background can come in and contribute something amazing to the James Bond franchise, as long as it comes from a place of reverence and authenticity. Because James Bond is an equal opportunities fandom. Everyone is welcome here. But it's like when you're kids. Everyone is welcome to come and play with our action figures. But it's like, you can't toss one action figure down the toilet or pretend that another action... I don't know. It's like being kids. You know, there are certain rules, but you have to play by the rules. And I think the rules are inclusive, and I think the rules celebrate diversity, but at the end of the day, you've just got to cling to that authenticity and cling to what it is we love about James Bond. Because for many of us, men or women, especially in the last couple of years, James Bond is something that has often sustained us when we've been in difficult times. So that's why it's a subject that I think we take so seriously. But from my perspective, I don't know. For me, I've just got to a stage in my life where I just enjoy whatever I have the opportunity to get. So, yeah, I'm now wondering on my James Bond calendar what's next. I guess it's going to be the 00 trilogy coming out next year. So Kim Sherwood, I'm really looking forward to that. But I just love to consume content made by James Bond fans, and I love to consume content made by James Bond fans who view James Bond from a perspective and experience different to my own. And the wonderful thing is, whoever in the Bond community that I've spoken to or met or engaged with, we've always had something in common, and we've always had some core ideals that we believe in. And I think James Bond is like a lodestone for that, and that's why the James Bond fan community is so special. It's because there are certain elements right at the core of what James Bond is that are good elements, they're strong elements, they're noble elements, and they bring good, strong, noble people together. And those people can come from any background, they can be any gender, they're just good people. And that's what I love about being part of the James Bond community. Thanks so much for watching that video. Don't forget, I've sold nearly 67,000 copies of my novels, so if you want to find out a bit more about that, don't forget to click the subscribe button.